An Audi is driving around Shanghai right now with no rings on the front of it. Not scratched off. Never put there in the first place. The company built it that way on purpose. It is called Audi in plain block letters, engineered side by side with a Chinese state-linked automaker, sold only in China, and it just won that country's Car of the Year award for 2026. That is the small, visible part of something much bigger. For 100 years, 3 names, Mercedes, BMW and Audi, fought each other for the same customers on the same roads, each one selling a version of the same promise, that nothing else on earth could match German engineering. Today, Chinese capital sits on their shareholder registers, Chinese startups run their driver assistance software, Chinese suppliers build the batteries under their floors, and Chinese platforms sit underneath the electric cars wearing their badges. None of it was forced on them. There was no hostile takeover, no single dramatic headline. Every step was signed willingly by the German companies themselves, one deal, one stake, one supply contract at a time, each one individually defensible, each one making perfect sense in isolation. This is the story of how 3 fierce rivals for 100 years ended up buying from the same Chinese supplier, answering to the same Chinese shareholders, and building the same Chinese-engineered car, and why, by the time any of them noticed the pattern, none of them really had a choice left anymore. Germany's luxury car brands built their empire in China one joint venture at a time. Audi got there first, signing a technology transfer agreement with the state-owned FAW Group in 1988 to build the Audi 100 in Changchun. In the early years, almost every single one of those cars went straight to the Chinese government. Black paint only, a tradition Audi's own dealers still lean on today. For an entire generation of Chinese officials, an Audi wasn't just a car, it was a rank. Volkswagen built on that head start, signing its own joint venture agreement with SEC in 1984, and opening the Shanghai plant the following year, becoming the default choice for the country's first wave of private car buyers. The company's own longtime China chief later described being met by enormous crowds who had never seen manufacturing of that quality up close, people who simply wanted to admire the paperwork and the brochures before they could even think about affording the car itself. Mercedes and BMW followed with joint ventures of their own, BMW Brilliance in 2003 and Beijing-Benz in 2005, and by the 2000s, owning a German badge had become the single clearest signal that a Chinese family had arrived. A German sedan parked outside a wedding, a business meeting or a government building said more about the owner's standing than almost anything else money could buy. China eventually made up roughly a third of these companies' entire global sales. Porsche alone sold 95,700 cars there in a single year at its peak. Buyers paid over sticker price just to get one sooner, and dealers kept waiting lists that stretched for months. China grew into the largest auto market on the planet during those same decades, and for a long stretch, nobody in Wolfsburg, Stuttgart or Munich seriously questioned whether that growth would keep flowing toward them. For 3 straight decades, the direction of the relationship was never in question. Germany built the cars and China supplied the demand. That dominance ran so deep that Volkswagen held the #1 sales spot among every automaker in China, foreign or domestic, for 25 consecutive years. Executives in Wolfsburg and Stuttgart built entire strategies around one quiet assumption, that combustion engineering excellence would always be what Chinese buyers wanted most, and that nobody in China could out-engineer Germany. For decades, that bet paid off. Chinese automakers spent years playing catch-up on engines and transmissions, categories where the Germans had a 100-year head start. Keep that assumption in mind, because it is about to become the single most expensive miscalculation in modern automotive history. While German engineers kept refining pistons and gearboxes, a different kind of Chinese competitor was quietly building something the Germans weren't even trying to build yet, a car engineered around software first, with the engine treated as an afterthought or removed entirely. China's own government helped tilt the board too, layering years of purchase subsidies and license plate incentives onto electric and plug-in hybrid models built by domestic brands, quietly turning national industrial policy into another advantage German combustion engineering had no answer for. Inside the German industry itself, the early Chinese EVs were treated for years as a curiosity rather than a threat. Cheaper alternatives nobody expected serious buyers to actually choose over an established European badge. Then, almost overnight, the ground moved. In 2023, Tesla triggered a brutal price war across China's EV market, and Chinese domestic brands, unburdened by decades of combustion tooling, undercut everyone almost instantly. The numbers tell the story on their own. In 2023, BYD registered 2.4 million vehicles in China for an 11% market share, while Volkswagen slipped to 2.3 million and 10.27%, ending a run at the top that stretched back to at least 2008. Geely finished the job 2 years later. By 2025, Volkswagen's own joint ventures held a combined 10.9% share of the market, down from 12.2% the year before, while Geely's share climbed to 11% from just 7.7%, enough to push Volkswagen down into third place entirely, behind two Chinese companies in a market it once treated as its own backyard. None of this came down to build quality. Chinese buyers, especially younger ones, wanted smart cockpits, constant software updates, and advanced driver assistance features that Chinese EV makers had spent years perfecting, and German brands had barely begun to build. Cars priced under roughly $21,500 made up more than half of all new passenger vehicle sales in China, a budget segment German luxury brands had never needed to compete in before and suddenly could not afford to ignore. By 2024, Mercedes sold only 710,000 cars in China, less than a third of Volkswagen's volume, yet still out-earned it on revenue, proof the premium badge still carried weight even while the volume war was being lost outright. 100 years of combustion mastery had become almost irrelevant to the exact customers German brands had spent decades cultivating. Facing a market collapsing under them in real time, German brands had two real options left: rebuild their own software and EV technology from scratch on a German timeline, or go directly to the companies already beating them and pay for access instead. They chose the second option, repeatedly and fast. In December 2023, Volkswagen bought a stake of almost 5% in Xpeng, one of the exact Chinese EV makers eating its lunch, and followed it with a master agreement to co-develop new Volkswagen-branded EVs using Xpeng's own electronic architecture. Starting in 2026, every electric Volkswagen sold in China runs on a platform built from that Chinese technology stack, badged with a German name on a Chinese foundation. Volkswagen's own China brand chief described the approach simply as building in China, for China, a strategy openly designed around Chinese partners rather than German ones. Audi went further still. Rather than try to make its historic four-ring badge appeal to a younger, faster-moving Chinese buyer, it built an entirely new brand from the ground up with SAIC, dropped the rings completely, and let Chinese engineers help shape the car's architecture from day one. Volkswagen didn't stop at platforms either. It is now developing its own next-generation smart car chip in-house, alongside Horizon Robotics, another Chinese partner, because the in-house silicon German automakers once designed themselves could no longer keep pace on its own. But that wasn't the only thing German brands would end up handing over just to stay in the race. The next concession went straight into the car's brain. Momenta, a Chinese autonomous driving startup that Mercedes itself had backed as an early investor, all the way back in 2017, is now the driver assistance supplier behind Mercedes' new electric CLA, BMW's China-built EVs, and Audi's ringless Audi brand, all three, at the same time. Three companies that spent a century marketing themselves as each other's fiercest rival are now buying their cars' core intelligence from the same Chinese startup, lining up at the same technology counter alongside General Motors, Toyota and Honda, who all rely on Momenta too. A senior Mercedes-Benz China executive framed it as building smarter, more intuitive systems tailored specifically to Chinese customers. Momenta's own chief executive was more direct, saying the rigor and speed of Mercedes standards set a benchmark for the industry. A striking thing to hear said about the one company that used to consider itself the industry's benchmark. BMW's chairman, Oliver Zipse, has publicly called China's innovation crucial to BMW's global strategy. Batteries followed the same pattern. Analysts now project that by 2027, Chinese suppliers could provide more than 60% of BMW's entire global battery volume, and BMW deepened its own battery agreement with CATL again in February 2026, signed during the German Chancellor's own visit to China. CATL itself built a battery factory on German soil in Thuringia, meaning some of the cells now going into German electric cars are manufactured inside Germany by a Chinese company rather than a German one. Mercedes has since announced a partial hedge, shifting some future battery orders from CATL to South Korea's Samsung SDI, starting in 2028. But the move only underlines how completely a Chinese supplier had come to dominate the category in the first place. Even Audi's big gamble hasn't gone smoothly. Its ringless Audi brand opened to roughly 10,000 early orders, then watched sales slip to around 6,500 units since the start of 2026, forcing price cuts of up to €3,700 just to keep momentum, while Audi quietly restructured its two Chinese joint ventures so that FAW keeps the historic 4-ring badge and SAIC handles the ringless brand alone. And that was only the technology layer. The next concession reached straight into the ownership structure itself. Design followed the same road as the software. Audi has run its own dedicated research studio in Beijing for years, specifically to make sure new models reflect what Chinese customers actually want, and China was the first market to get an Audi A6 stretched with a longer wheelbase, purely because local buyers valued backseat legroom more than anywhere else on Earth. That local design influence now runs in the opposite direction too. The extended A6 experiment that started as a China-only concession became a template other markets eventually adopted. A car that once carried Germany's design language out into the world was starting to carry China's preferences back into Germany's own studios, a quiet reversal nobody at either company ever needed to announce out loud. Li Shufu's Geely had already been buying up Western car brands for years by the time it turned to Germany, picking up Volvo cars, the sports car maker Lotus, and eventually a stake in Malaysia's Proton along the way. In 2018, he spent roughly $9 billion to buy a 9.69% stake in Daimler, becoming the single largest shareholder in the company that makes the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Then Beijing Automotive Group, a Chinese state-owned automaker that had already been Mercedes' own joint venture partner in China since 2019, built its own position in the same company up past his to 9.98%, edging out Li to become Mercedes-Benz Group's single largest shareholder in its own right. Combined, those two Chinese holders now control 19.67% of the company, nearly 1/5 of the entire shareholder register, belonging to one of Germany's most iconic industrial names. For comparison, the Kuwait Investment Authority, a sovereign wealth fund that has held a stake in the company since the 1970s, owns only around 6.8%, less than either Chinese holder on its own. Early in 2026, reports surfaced of Mercedes deepening its cooperation talks with Geely even further, extending a relationship the company had already leaned into for years. None of this was hostile. Mercedes needed the capital and the manufacturing relationships that came with it, and it accepted the entanglement willingly, deal by deal, year after year. That entanglement was about to collide head-on with the one government whose approval German car makers needed most, on the exact opposite side of the planet. In 2026, a bill called the Motor Vehicle Modernization Act landed in the US House of Representatives, introduced by the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. It targeted any automaker with an equity tie to a foreign adversary government, and people close to the bill said its language would very likely capture Mercedes-Benz because of BAIC's stake, threatening a 5-year block on manufacturing, importing or selling its cars anywhere in the United States. That is a direct threat to a company running a plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that has built more than 5 million vehicles since 1997, and a second plant in South Carolina that has produced more than 450,000 passenger vans since 2006. At almost the same moment, the Chinese market that started all of this began collapsing under German brands entirely. In the second quarter of 2026, China sales at Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW and Porsche all fell between 30 and 41% year over year. Volkswagen's China deliveries alone dropped 36.6% to 424,300 vehicles, dragging its global sales down 8.6%, and the company responded by announcing it would slash its China model lineup by as much as half. Porsche's China sales, which had peaked at 95,700 cars in 2021, had fallen to just 41,900 by 2025, a fourth straight annual decline, and the brand's total worldwide deliveries fell roughly 10% that same year. Proof the damage was no longer contained to one country. Mercedes expanded layoffs into its research and engineering divisions after a 27% first-quarter China sales plunge, offering severance packages of up to 9 months extra pay just to shrink the workforce fast enough. BMW's China sales have now declined for 3 consecutive years. The company cut its profit forecast to a razor-thin margin, its stock hit a 6-year low, and it announced plans to discontinue some of its domestically produced electric models because of weak demand. Volkswagen went on to announce plans to cut up to 100,000 jobs globally and close 4 plants on German soil. The pressure wasn't staying inside China's borders either. BYD and fellow Chinese brand Chery crossed a combined 10% share of new car sales in Europe for the first time in May 2026 on German automakers' own home continent. An automotive analyst at AlixPartners put the new reality bluntly, saying foreign automakers are going to have to fight for every share of the market. Another analyst summarized the broader picture just as plainly, saying every European automaker is losing market share. So what actually happened here? It came down to 3 decisions, each one made in good faith, each one compounding the last. First, German brands spent a decade assuming their advantage in combustion engineering would carry over automatically into an electric, software-defined future, and it simply didn't. 100 years of engine expertise turned out to be almost worthless against a rival that skipped the engine entirely and built the car around the software from the very first sketch. Second, once that assumption collapsed, German brands didn't just borrow Chinese technology to catch back up. They let Chinese capital directly onto their own ownership registers to help fund the catch-up. That decision meant the exact fix for the market they were losing turned into a liability in the market they needed most. The moment Washington started asking who actually owned the company building cars on American soil. Third, without a single press conference ever framing it this way, the meaning of German engineering quietly became a joint production. An Audi with no rings on the grille, a Mercedes whose driving intelligence comes from a Chinese startup that Mercedes' own money helped build almost a decade earlier. A shareholder list carrying more Chinese capital than at any point in the company's 140-year history. A design studio in Beijing quietly reshaping what a German sedan is supposed to look like everywhere else in the world. It leaves one question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Every one of these deals looks survivable on its own. A stake here, a supplier contract there, a badge swapped out for a single overseas market. Strung together, they added up to something none of these companies ever intended to become. What happens to a legacy industry once the supplier it depends on for survival grows larger, faster, and more essential than the market it was originally built to sell into?